welcome to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we wish to discuss with you the issue of education, and in dealing with that, we're going to be talking about several areas with our distinguished guest who is qualified to deal with the subject. We'll be talking about educational reform, we'll talk about children at risk, and we'll talk about dropouts and a number of other subjects. We'll be getting involved in such things also as conflict resolution. I welcome to the program Jerry Conrath, who comes to us from Gig Harbor, Washington. He has an impressive background. He is adjunct instructor this year at 3 different institutions: Portland State University, the University of Idaho, and Seattle Pacific University. He holds a BS degree from Portland State University and an MST degree in political science from that same institution, and has done PhD studies at the University of Oregon. His professional background and publications is a very exhaustive list, and I will not attempt to go into that tonight, but take the opportunity to welcome Jerry Conrath to the program.
Thank you very much, Tony.
I'm very pleased to have 2 panel members to join today in questioning our guest. To my immediate left is Ann Smart, and we want to thank Ann because she is responsible for our guest this evening. She is the Special Projects Coordinator for the University of Idaho, and we also express our appreciation, Ann, to the University of Idaho for making this guest possible, and welcome you to the program.
Thank you.
And regular panelist Steve Schink, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and I shall ask Steve to commence the questioning.
Thank you, Tony. Jerry, Tony alluded to your background. I've had a chance to look at your vita too, and it is indeed very impressive. I think we're going to start this evening with a discussion of at-risk children in public schools. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about your background, some of the experiences you've had, and how you became interested in this topic.
Well, I went into teaching in the early 60s after pursuing another career in music, and wanted to be a history teacher. And my first job teaching history in Oregon was advanced placement history, so the fanciest, most obedient, cheerful, loyal, trustworthy kids you can find. And I found that my assignment in the afternoon, in the morning indeed I had this advanced placement 3 hours. The afternoon I had what the school called in those days bonehead history. And I had no idea what that was. And of course what that was a bunch of surly, cranky, frustrated, discouraged, unmotivated, defeated kids. And in my work with those kids, I found myself much more interested in helping kids that were struggling with school than in helping the other kids, although the advanced placement kids were real sweethearts. I really enjoyed working with the kids who didn't like history, didn't like me, and they came predisposed, to dislike everything about the world. And helping those youngsters see that history was an important subject, and they needed to know, and they could learn, they could think, they could solve problems. They were not boneheads at all. And I got really fascinated by convincing these kids that they didn't lack intellect, what they lacked were academic skills, and those are things that could be learned if they would work hard enough at it. And I got really fascinated with that, and then I pursued my public school teaching career for another 20 years, focusing on the kids we now call at-risk youth. And I set up some alternative programs, and in the Portland area, I set up some dropout prevention classes at the high schools, and just generally became a so-called specialist in dropout prevention.
That group of students that we're calling at risk, the ones who are prime candidates to drop out of school and probably have related problems, how big a group is that? How big a problem is it in this area and nationally?
Nationally, we're probably talking about 35 to 40% of our population, somewhere between 28 and 30 drop out. So probably at least 40 is a pretty conservative figure of kids who struggle, get frustrated, develop low self-esteem, begin to avoid school, begin to see school as a threatening place to be as opposed to a nourishing, helpful place to be. In this area, I can't imagine why it wouldn't be very similar to that.
Ann?
Our national priorities, particularly when dealing with youth, are trying to combat substance abuse, child abuse, dropout, crime. What do you see as the school's role in this? They seem to be putting quite an emphasis to the schools as solving our nation's problems. And how do you see this as the school's role, and what do you think the schools how do you think they should undertake this task?
That's a complicated question, Ann. First place, the fundamental cause for kids becoming frustrated, discouraged, hostile towards systems, including school systems, developing a sense of what's the point, what's the use of all this, does not reside in the schools. It resides in our cultures of poverty. Economic conditions is a high correlation in our country between school failure, school dropping out, and children of economic and social disadvantage. 13 million children in this country live in poverty conditions. 32 million Americans live at or below the federal government's official poverty line. And of that, that we're talking about a little over $12,000 a family income a year for a family of four. It's talking about pretty grim economic conditions. Those children also suffer undernutrition. They suffer inadequate medical care. The United States is the highest country on earth of per capita expenditure for medical attention, yet we rank with third world countries for the medical attention we bring to our youth. So as a nation, we're really throwing away our youth. And I think as a nation who throws away its youth, or a culture who does not take care of its young, deserves what it gets. And what we're getting are the youth getting to the streets and looking for assault rifles and finding ways to fight back. And we're wringing our hands and saying, oh my goodness, what's the matter with the kids these days? What's the matter with the schools these days? And my analysis is the cancer is in our society. It's in our economic system. Now, specifically within the schools, I think schools have to do everything they can and work double time to overcome. They can't prevent these conditions from happening. Our nation could, if as a nation we decided we wanted to bring adequate medical attention, adequate nutrition to our youth. We could do that tomorrow. If we can bail out savings and loans and send troops to the Middle East, we can certainly help our children. We don't have the will, the political will right now to do so. And we haven't, probably for 30 years, or at least since the war on poverty. But the schools have to do a lot to, since they do inherit this condition of the kids, they have to do everything they can, starting with kindergarten, to overcome these discouraging and disadvantage conditions the kids bring to school. And my number one agenda for the schools would be the first thing to do it, K through 3, get that class size down to 12 or 15 kids so that that expert professional can really work effectively with all of these children. And right now with 25, 30 to 1, or even 20 to 1, that's not possible. I would also ask the schools to be involved, and that has to be, again, federal funding has to be restored in Head Start programs, better nutrition programs to the schools. All these programs that were cut during the Reagan years, we have to do something to start to restore, at least to get back to where we were in 1981, which wasn't very good. So those would be my initial agendas for the schools to overcome some of those conditions that kids bring to the school. Of the systems that kids grow up in, family system, economic system, and school system, school is the only system that even remotely can promise an equal opportunity to kids. But they can't do that with 32 kids, to a kindergarten teacher's, a first grade teacher's classroom. But at least a school is designed. The ideology of public school is equal opportunity. The ideology of our economic system is not equal opportunity. So schools have a lot of role here, but it's very crude of our culture and our people to say, well, the schools are the problem, the schools are failing the kids, the schools are not doing their jobs. I think they're doing a remarkably wonderful job given the resources and the problems that these kids bring to school.
You have created a real interest with your comment, excuse me, about classroom size. 2 senators in Idaho introduced legislation last year to mandate reduction in classroom size K through 3, and I understand it will be introduced again the next session. Could you take a moment, because it is an issue in Idaho, to give us some studies where you compare students that are in a smaller classroom size with those larger? How significant is that as a factor in what happens to young people, and particularly about dropouts?
There aren't too many studies done because almost no public schools have that kind of ratio. So it's a hypothetical assumption that if we could allow a kindergarten or first grade teacher to have, or a second grade teacher, maybe 15, 16 kids, we would certainly increase the odds tremendously all those kids will learn to read, and all those kids would get adequate attention from a caring adult. We do have some models of private schools, of course, who have some very different luxuries that public schools don't have. They do indeed have 12 to 15 to 1. And that's often what they cite as their reason why they're successful with these kids. They also cite lack of bureaucratic restrictions, but that's not true. They do have other types of bureaucratic restrictions. My plea for those senators would be 2 things. One is to make sure you fund it, so that the money is there, not just saying schools go do this. because legislators are very fond of saying, we have a great idea, teachers ought to do something about
This bill has it built in the funding.
Wonderful. And the other would be how they count. Are they really going to count 15 to 1 as a classroom teacher ratio, or is it going to be a school building personnel ratio? Usually class sizes are computed by all of the adults in the building, librarians and aides and counselors and vice principals, and then they'll talk about what their class size is, where in fact the teacher is still looking at 33 kids every hour. So I've got some cautions about that, but I think it's a noble gesture, at least at this point, on the part of those legislators.
You've also in your work indicated that you believe in redirecting aggressive student behavior. And I'll do one more question before I go back to the panel. Since you've had a lot of experience and you've worked with what one might call more challenging students, what are some of the strategies that you can use to redirect the behavior?
Well, what kids who are struggling with school, for the most part, unless you're talking about some very violent kids who need attention that schools can't provide in terms of psychiatric care, kids have to know that the adults they're dealing with, are very kind, very helpful, not competitive type of personalities. Awful lot of misbehavior from kids in school, especially kids who are learning to dislike school and to be threatened by school, is a competitive stance. Adults get into this competitive stance. I got to show this kid who's boss, you know. And when we get into that competitive stance with a kid, we lose our ability to be an effective adult. So always maintaining an effective adult stance. I'm here to help you. I'm good at that. That's my profession. That's my art, and I can do that. And the other, of course, is being very tough-minded. Adults who work with kids, kids who struggle with school do not need more warm fuzzies. What they need is extra help doing well on difficult work. And that's the message I try to deliver all over the country, because a lot of people who also travel around and talk don't say those kinds of things. You know, the best thing to help a kid who's struggling in school is to get this kid to understand is that hard work done well feels good. And youngsters who have suffered school failure have come to see hard work as something to avoid. And they often grow up in homes where the parents have a similar sort of mentality. So I think there's a lot of adult behaviors we need to take a look at. Most conflicts within the classroom are things that adults could control and manage very well if they didn't trigger the response. Adults in schools, again, for a lot of reasons, class size is one, tend to get very frustrated themselves and very discouraged themselves about the kid who doesn't want to do it. The adult stays up until 3 a.m. developing this wonderful lesson plan. The kid says, this is boring. And they just don't know how to overcome those hurdles. And that's much of what I do in the classes that I teach with teachers.
Steve Schenck.
We've almost moved into another area. We've been talking about class size in particular as a factor that can help at-risk students. Are there other attributes other than the ones you just talked about that you think are important in successful teachers?
Those are the most important attributes in successful teachers. I think there's an attribute in schools that is we have to take some attention to, that is getting our curriculum more integrated. I think one of the things that we do that is difficult for a lot of kids, but particularly kids who don't get a lot of help at home in terms of school assignments and understanding the importance of school, is that our curriculum is so fragmented. I mean, you get into middle school and high school, every hour bell rings and a kid runs somewhere else and starts a new subject, and whatever intellectual process is going on, the bell interrupts it and we say, now start a new process. And that's a fragmented, chaotic way to organize mental training. So I think after we take a look at what are the teacher characteristics, and I've touched on those, and then I think we have to look at our curriculum as well as the class size.
At the beginning of the show, you commented on the honors or advanced placement course that you taught and the bonehead history course that you taught. Is that concept, I think you see it a lot in schools, I think you see it at the earliest level in reading groups. I think they try to hide it from kids. You call one group the bluebirds and one group the blackbirds, but everybody knows who the fast readers are and who the slow readers are. Is it a bad idea to separate students on the basis of ability or preparedness or other factors?
When you're teaching a specific skill like reading, no. When you're organizing a youngster's intellectual day for 6 hours, it's a terrible thing to do. What's really bad, even if it's doing with reading, is associate slow reading, which is a tempo and rhythm, with low intellectual ability. You know, kids who develop slower reading skills, and I'm one. I still am a slow reader in terms of procedure, but I'm not necessarily a discouraged reader. I'm sorry, I love to read. I can read complicated, sophisticated stuff. It just takes me a long time. Now that's a phenomenon of multiple intelligences. So it's not a matter of the kid who reads slowly lacks intelligence. What he lacks or she lacks is the type of intelligence where linguistic development comes easily. And with all that we know now in terms of multiple intelligence, we know that that's a fact. So the kid who does struggle with reading speed and comprehension back in the second and third grade does need to have extra help, but never in the sense that we're giving you something that's dummied down or something that's low level. And if I had my way, we'd just eliminate words like basic classes, and I think the worst insult at all we lay on kids is reluctant learner. We think we've progressed from the words calling kids boneheads to calling them reluctant learners. That's probably the worst insult we have, is to tell a kid you're a reluctant learner. Some kids are reluctant schoolers, but not reluctant learners. They learn. My students that I taught were marvelous learners. They just weren't academically inclined, but they could have been. They learned lots of things on the streets. I just assumed they didn't learn, but they learned very, very well. And to call them reluctant learners is silly, silly insult. I'm sorry.
For the great majority of students that you've seen in your career, is there a huge difference in actual intellectual ability, or is it differences in motivation or preparedness?
Well, there's two or three differences. One is a difference in the type of intellect, not how much, quantity, but the type. And all of the assumptions about intellect as being a quantifiable, singular, measurable phenomenon has pretty much been laid to rest by people who study the intelligences in the brain. The issue with the kid who struggles at school is not, does the kid have adequate intelligence? The issue is in which way is this kid intelligent? So the kids very much differ in terms of their intellectual qualities, but not the quantity factor. Other factors, of course, are preparedness and the medical attention that I've talked about. Kids who don't get adequate medical care come to kindergarten very often suffering eyesight loss and hearing loss, and they don't know it, and the teacher doesn't know it, and the parents don't know it. And they start to fall behind, and because it's a totally external phenomenon, lack of medical or nutritional attention, for which the kid has no responsibility, the youngster is immediately accused of lacking motivation, lacking interest, lacking intellect. Because of external phenomenon, we accuse the kid of lacking internal resources, which is a terrible thing to do to our young.
And smart.
In your symposiums, you have a topic called Interagency Cooperation. Mm-hmm. How do we involve multiple agency systems together in a network? We've talked mainly about schools and what schools can do to change, but this is a community concern. And how do you propose that we involve multiple agencies?
I think what you're doing tonight is a wonderful way to start doing this. People are watching who are not, this is not just a program aired to educators. I think both your colleges need to take a lot of role here in having done this. I think the symposium, where we are bringing in people from different backgrounds, they may or may not be youth workers, but they're interested in youth. They're not just educators. I think the type of public pressure that we've brought to bear politically on the schools to do a better job and to reform, which I think is not an unhealthy thing, ought to be brought to the medical profession. You know, what is the medical profession doing to bring care to the kids who don't now receive medical care? Where are they in this? They certainly have a responsibility. So what is the, what are churches, what are other type of youth organizations doing to do a better job of helping these kids receive what kids in a culture have to receive, which is to learn that they are parts of a culture. They're not alienated from the culture. So I think more and more public awareness, what you're doing here, plus more and more, if the people who, for political reasons, want to bring pressure on schools to do a better job, I would like to see them expand those political pressures into other arenas of service agencies as well.
But these agencies, don't they need to network with each other? How do you propose that they do that? Rather than deal with each individual area in which there is their responsibility, how do they network with each other? Where's the responsibility?
Everybody. I think somebody has to take the initiative, and in the case that we're describing here, your two schools are, and I think our symposium is, some agency has to say, wait a minute, we're going to take the initiative and we want to bring people in and we want to talk about a shared responsibility. You know, these are the youth of our culture, for better or for worse. They're either going to be leaders of tomorrow or destroyers of our, and there's a lot of destruction going on now. And we have a stake in this, we better do something about it. I don't know where I would say, I think whoever, the initiative would come from the first agency that says we're willing to take the risk and take the initiative. In the case of North Idaho, we have a couple in terms of the symposium and the classes that the university puts on and what you're doing here at this college tonight. But I don't have a formula for saying who. I would look to the legislator to take some initiative in this. Are they the legislature in Idaho, which is wisely perhaps saying that we should lower class size? Are they also taking some initiative to provide not emergency, but truly splendid medical care to every baby that's born in this state? And if they're not willing to do this, then I think they're going to pay a real price.
As you discussed this really major undertaking of lots of agencies and institutions, as Ann has asked you, you get into funding, you get into conflict between different interests of how money is going to be appropriated and so forth. And so also I know one of your expertise is strategies in conflict resolution, so I'd kind of like to move into that area.
Okay.
As you do find increased conflict in trying to bring those programs into place, because there is a price tag, or change itself causes some people to resist, and I hear you suggesting change. What kind of strategies would you propose to deal with those conflicts as they arise?
Well, you're being kind to me. I probably have more skills in creating conflict than in managing or resolving conflict. I think the best strategy in the area we're talking about tonight, a lot of the times when I do conflict resolution or conflict management things between adult and adult and kid, it really has more to do with behavioral techniques. I think that, again, the strategic issue tonight is, identifying adults in the community ought to be able to identify, what do we want, what do we need for our young, and how are we going to provide that. And the best, and if I think conflict is inherent in human condition. So if they do have conflict with them, that's probably wonderful, because out of that conflict, if they act like adults, could come some very creative solutions. I think this nation now is just poverty-stricken for creative solutions. We keep pointing the finger of blame at the schools. We keep claiming we have a war on drugs, and I haven't seen a war on drugs. I've seen a war on inner-city poor. I haven't seen a war on drugs going on in this country. I think those conflicts have to be battled out at the presidential campaign level. I wish when Dukakis was a candidate, he had talked about some of this stuff. He had a forum for talking about these conflicts, which are terribly important conflicts. We're talking about a generation of our kids now that we've thrown away, and we can't afford to throw away another generation.
Although we're using this medium of television to do what you're talking about, and we're doing it in a little more depth, but when you get in a presidential election and you have 30-second spots, what are the chances of this happening?
Not very good. Yeah, not very good. I think we have a sort of an instant gratification, medium here, and not very good. Based on what has become the norm of what we see as presidential so-called debates and presidential campaigning. But in spite of that, the form is there. They still do make public speeches in front of people for an hour, and they could do something more significant and more sophisticated than wrapping themselves in the flag and saying the flag salute. They could talk about the problems of our youth, and they could, somebody ought to, I think, tell the president just to say you want to be the education president is really not enough. You're going to have to make some action and do something if you really want to go down in history as the education president.
Steve Sheen.
Jerry, why do you think a country that talks so much about the importance of its youth and providing for the next generation has done so little? Is it a lack of those creative solutions you talked about? Is it a lack of an awareness? Is it a sense that it's other people's kids that are having the problem?
I think it's all of that. I also I think that's their last point is especially good. They really sense that, well, these aren't my kids; these are other people's kids. But when we are in fear of walking the streets because of those other people's kids, and all of a sudden that becomes a cultural issue. I would like to see us as a culture get more what anthropologists tell us cultures ought to be, much more of an issue where our job in the culture is to get our kids to become part of this culture and to feel good about being part of this culture. And that's where we're failing so badly. So we're failing both on an anthropological sense and educational, but also a political sense. I also think, like I said at the outset of the program, that the whole attitude that this country has had for at least 20 years now toward poverty and toward the poor, I think there's more cynicism and more prejudice and more discrimination against the poor in this country than in any other part of our population. And I think we have to decide as a country sometime is that nobody gets up in the morning and says, I think I'd like to be poor. Poverty happens to people, and it's a devastating thing, and we're talking now about many people who are into third and fourth generational poverty. Many of our people living below those 32 million I talked about living below the federal government's poverty line are working poor. They have jobs. And 8, 9 years ago, if in this country, if you got a full-time job, even at minimum wage, you did not fall below the poverty line. Now, through the 1980s, that's no longer true. You can get a full-time job, work for minimum wage, and fall below the federal government's poverty line. So the ethic in this country that hard work pays off is no longer a valid ethic. And we have to, as a culture, come to terms with that and see what, if we accept what I said at the outset, that poverty and the despair and the sense of anesthetization of hope and optimism that comes from children born into poverty, that's the number one problem with our schools. It's not the problem of curriculum and poor teaching.
And we have about 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
Okay. This summer when I was talking with you, you posed the question of are children ready for school? And you say, I turn that around saying, are our schools ready for our children? What do you mean by that?
That's a marvelous summary to this program. I mean, are we prepared to take on these children who come to us with eyesight damage and hearing damage? And are we prepared to reach out to those kids? Are we prepared to really practice what we know about learning styles and multiple intelligences and cooperative learning? Are we really prepared to change the things we do, because what we do has obviously not worked for a large percentage of our population? And rather than call the schools a failure or the kids a failure, I just prefer to say we have to do some things differently. And right now, with this year's kindergarten kids is the time to start, not with this year's high school kids. And that's what I mean, are we ready for these kids? With all of these problems that kids didn't have when a lot of us who now are in our late 50s were trained to be teachers. Are we ready for these differences? And my answer is not, we're not even close to being ready for them.
Are you optimistic of where we're going?
I'm optimistic when I talk with educators who talk more and more about the need to implement, for example, multiple intelligences and all that we know about that. I'm pessimistic when I talk to policymakers who get more interested in standardization. And the more we emphasize standardized testing and the notion of a standardized intellect, the more we move away from what we need to do. So I see those two forces as incompatible.
I must close the program. Jerry, on behalf of our panel and our staff, thank you. It's been an extremely informative program, and I know it's been helpful to our viewers.
Good, I've enjoyed it. So.
Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you've enjoyed our program, and we'd invite you to be with us again next week at the same time, when we believe we will discuss another important subject that will be of interest to you. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.